Okay, we're
Sounds
ready
good.
to go. Welcome, everyone, to our Zoom conversation with Alaskans with New Books. I'm David Stevenson, your moderator and host. We want to thank Alaska Center for the Book, and especially Trish Jenkins and Lila Voigt for their technical assistance and all the work they do for literacy in Alaska. Our format tonight is each of the four writers, Christine Byl, Sharon Emmerichs, John Messick, and Melinda Moustakis, will introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their new book. And then afterwards, we'll have a kind of a round the horn discussion, talking about how their book came together and what their reading interests are and influences and so on. So welcome, thanks for being here. And here's Christine.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for inviting me, David. Thanks, everybody, for joining. And yes, to all the sponsors who I won't remember well enough to start naming, but thanks to everyone. I am for my new book, Lookout. It's my first novel, my second book, but my first novel. And it's, well, actually, I'm just going to read first, if that's okay. I'm terrible at describing it, so I can read and then I'll maybe say a couple words afterwards. I'm going to start from the very first chapter. The chapter is called Start Small, and it's in 1985. The summer of the fires started cool and damp. A heavy snow in early May buried past flowers and daffodils and the barely rising shoots that would become the season's crops. But by the end of the month, the sun lit up like a match. Standing water dried faster than it had in years, and by June, the once puddled ground was hard and hot as a steel skillet. No one remembered the cold. Midsummer, Cody Kinsler woke to light. Bedtime and morning looked alike, crickets and stars hidden by sun, the only thing visible the strut of day. By the time Cody stirred, dark was hours gone. She lifted her arm against the light between the slatted shades, the back of her hand tanned above her moon-white palm. In the mornings, Cody's father was outside, always. She often ate breakfast alone, Louisa sleeping late and their mother with the hens or in the garden, and Cody looked out the window to see the weather unchanged, hot, blue, bright. Cody was 9, old enough to pour her own cereal or make toast dark and hard, topped with a soft-boiled egg cooling from the stove. Her mother said too much salt, but Cody liked it between her teeth like sand. She practiced wolfing her eggs like her father did, fast, so she could help him with the stock before he left for work. Josiah bent around the stall gates and horses' necks like wire, his hand laid firm on withers or roughing a satiny neck against its grain. The animals' morning noises hushed as they fell on their food, and the sun shouldered into the dim barn between cracks in the warped boards. When Josiah left for the hardware store, Cody returned to the house to see who had appeared. Her mother from outside, her sister from their bedroom, wordless and sticky-eyed. Louisa slept like it was her job. All morning, Cody roamed, pasture to Aspen Grove, riverbank to gravel pit. She ranged like a prospector. The dogs followed close, disappearing in brush after squirrel or scent to emerge again later, so reliably that Cody hardly noticed they were gone. She sat on the paddock fence and scratched the horses' flanks when they pressed her legs. She trapped mice with a baited tin can, held their noses up to hers, and let them go. She bounced pebbles at the chickens, which ruffled them into great squawking piles, and then chased them until she could lift one in her arms, light as a loaf of store-bought bread. Margaret glimpsed her daughter when she thought to look, but mostly Cody's day slid past in unwatched hours. Louisa darted in and out of her games less often than she used to, as phone calls and girlfriends and moody hours in her room supplanted their sisterish rhythms. Alone, Cody dug holes, sorted dirt and stones into piles. She rarely threw rocks anymore, not even small ones, since Clint Lindsay put out the eye of a crow by accident. The bird had staggered the schoolyard in circles, its eye a blood-hit, wings spread, croaking angry protest. Cody loved the chickens and would rather have put out her own eye, or Clint's. She liked to cause a ruckus, not to harm, but sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. So that is the start, and it's basically it's a book about a working class family in Northwest Montana, set from roughly the late 60s through the present. It's about the main character, Cody, and her father and their family. And it's been described as a coming of age story, a queer Western, a multi-generational family saga, however you want to put it. But that's kind of the main, how I'd describe it. I'm terrible at the elevator pitch, obviously.
It must have worked though.
Yeah, I guess.
All right. Thanks, Christine. Sharon?
Hi, I'm Sharon Emmerichs. My book, oops, and I just lost my place. I'm sorry. My book is Shield Maiden, which is coming out October 3rd from Orbit Hatchet. And if you give me just a moment, I will see. I didn't look at what the page number was. And I will, I'm going to read a portion here from a battle. This book has been described by a lot of critics as a real page turner, as action packed. So I kind of wanted to read a section that has some of that action in it. So here we go. Frida quickly realized that a lifetime of stories about great battles could not prepare her for the experience of actually being in one. She ran after Theo, but almost immediately lost him in the maelstrom of men flooding the grounds of the burg. When the Shopes sang about the clanging of arms, the shouts of men, of the clatter of iron as warriors made a shield wall, and a rattle of fire-hardened ashwood spears, they neglected to mention the resulting cacophony was so disorienting that commonplace skills such as walking and navigation would desert her completely. Exiles clad in Eidgil's colors clashed with her father's warriors, who streamed from the barracks as they tugged on their mail shirts and stiff leather greaves. Members of the Yadrit shouted orders, and shield maidens unleashed their war cries. Older children, not yet grown enough to do battle, gathered up the small ones and herded them towards the farmsteads near the western gate, far from the worst of the fighting. Frida tried to keep her bearings as she ducked and dodged her way through the mayhem, searching for a glimpse of Theo's fire-colored hair. Her lack of height meant she could not see over the heads of the men, and their bodies obscured her view of the buildings. She stopped in the middle of the clash of arms, dizzy and disoriented. An exile thrust his sword at the back of one of Weostan's warriors, who was engaged in battle with another man. Without stopping to think, Frida darted forward and swung her poker at the exile's helmet, which made a resonant ringing noise, and the man crumpled to the ground. Frida crouched down and made herself as small as possible while she moved through the pulsing throng, searching for anything to pinpoint her location. She tucked her damaged hand under her other arm, trying to protect it from the frenzied violence of the battle. One of her father's own men, giving chase to an exile fleeing his spear, saw the blue of her dress and the yellow of her hair, and obviously thinking her an exile, kicked her in the ribs as he passed her. Frida dropped like a stone. Lightning and fire seemed to shoot through her side, and she groaned as every breath tore new definitions of pain through her body. She clutched to her ribs with her good hand. They must be broken, she thought. In her experience, only cracked bones could hurt this much. A man in blue and yellow, a spearhead sticking out from the center of his chest, tripped over her, and he fell atop her body. She managed to twist her torso at the last minute to avoid the spear protruding from his ribcage, but the impact jarred loose every ache in her body and lancing pain from her ribs, shoulder, and hand. The exile's face, covered in sweat, hovered only inches from hers, and his blood made dark patches wet on her blue silk dress. His mouth twisted into a snarl, but Frida could not tear her gaze from his eyes. They pleaded with her, full of fear, as if begging for reassurance that death had not at that moment conquered him. But she saw the life leave his body, and he slumped against her, heavy and immovable. It took some doing, but she eventually managed to wriggle out from under his corpse. Gasping, she staggered to her feet. She had to find her father, but there were so many men. At first, the exiles seemed to swarm the burg like ants on honey, their numbers greater than her father's fighters. However, as the warriors belonging to the other kings and clan leaders answered the call of the horn and gathered from every corner of the burg, soldiers from Denmark, Norway, Frisia, and Skane, the number of blue and yellow-clad fighters began to diminish. In their armor, the warriors seemed twice their usual size. Booted feet kicked up dirt and dust that stung Frida's eyes and made her cough. Thick black smoke rolled over the battlefield like dragon's breath. The exiles must have put the burgh's outer buildings to the torch, and Frida chilled to think of Theo there. Her mind conjured grotesque images of her family trapped inside a burning building, unable to escape. Beneath the acrid stench of flame and fire lay the uglier odors of blood and death, of fear and desperation. The warriors' shouts heaved up to the sky, songs of triumph mingled with the music of suffering, offerings of carrion to the eager ravens and eagles circling the battle high above. So this also has kind of a crisis of genre as it has gone through its journey towards publication. It's been called a retelling of the Beowulf poem, a reimagining. It's been called a fantasy, an historical fantasy, a romantasy. It's just been called all kinds of things. But basically what I wanted to do was I concentrated this book on the final battle that Beowulf fights with a dragon. And I shifted the focus from Beowulf as the hero to a woman, his niece, who wants to be a shield maiden. And this really is her story. Thank you.
Very exciting. And it came out in Great Britain first.
It did, actually. It came out in the UK in February, on February 2nd. And on February 5th, I was informed that it had hit the Sunday Times top 10 bestseller list.
Oh, that's thrilling. It'll be fun to watch what happens to it here.
I'm a little nervous about it, but I'm still really excited. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Okay, here's John Messick.
Yeah, hi. First of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be able to share this space with all of you who I look up to and see as incredible writers. I teach actually sections of Melinda's book, and Christine Dirtwork brings me back to the good end of a Pulaski every time I read it. So thank you very much. My book is called Compass Lines, Journeys Toward Home. More and more, I think I have to call it a memoir in essays, though I, for a long time, wanted to call it travel writing, and it's that as well. It's essentially a book about how I ended up in Alaska. It's a book about becoming a father. It's a book about moving from the naivety of wanting to see the world and being youth to understanding the importance of grounding yourself in place. I'll read kind of a short section here on Alaska that I think kind of collects a little bit of that into a scene. Some of it stems from the work of Dr. Alan Boris, who was a very close friend of mine who passed away in 2019. Just before I moved to Alaska, I stayed in Istanbul for a week with an American expatriate named Jim. One day, Jim took me and his mother on a tour of the city's mosques and churches. We took ferries across the Bosporus, hopped trains and buses, marveled at blue mosaics while Jim expounded on the architectural fluidity of Ottoman religious buildings. Later, we walked through the alleyways of the Golden Horn, where we stopped to check out a small church near the home of the Patriarch of Constantinople, the spiritual leader of Orthodox Christianity across the globe. We arrived too late to visit the parish, but just in time to see Patriarch Bartholomew, flanked by security guards, climbing into a black sedan. The car stopped next to us, and the driver stepped out to open the rear door. The Patriarch beckoned us to the car. I bowed my head, and he pressed a bracelet of prayer beads into my hand. He handed the same gift to Jim's mother, but when Jim stepped in for a blessing, the Patriarch couldn't find another bracelet. Finally, he rummaged through his cassock, pulled out his keys, and removed a small LED light from the keychain. He demonstrated it by clinking the switch on and off several times, then handed it over. "A light," said the Patriarch, "to shine." The car pulled away, and he was gone. I told that story to my coworker, friend, and mentor, Alan Boris, not long before he died in 2019. Alan was one of Alaska's most respected anthropologists and one of the most gifted and empathetic thinkers I've ever known. a man who fought for land and subsistence rights regardless of the consequences, who understood that the people who have lived in a place longest generally have the most to teach us about how best to reside there. He thought about my story for a long time before he replied. You really only need a flashlight for about half the year up here, he said. And we laughed, but then Alan added that if you know a place well enough, you didn't need a light at all. He told me about a ski trip he took once where he'd gotten caught out near dark in unfamiliar country, but had made his way home because the Dena'ina place names, which he had studied for the lakes and the ridge lines where he was traveling, had directions embedded in them. Knowing the land had kept him safe. Alan's work on indigenous spirituality makes the claim that we elevate to the sacred those things that are most important in our lives. And he believed that people needed to spend time with a place, nurturing it and navigating it to have a real relationship with that place. In a world where we've hacked away at our own roots, it isn't easy to develop personal connections. The cohesive narrative that we envision, the one about finding ourselves and our faith, about healing and purpose and our own little slice of paradise, distorts the reality and the complexity of just being present. When we never stop searching, the balance of our lives never quite reaches equilibrium. Too often, I have sought reinvention by moving from place to place without pausing to reflect. I tear off one mask only to find another underneath. I've embarked on quest upon quest to address problems created because I wasn't willing to simply be still, and I am still learning to be homesick. So perhaps it matters less what we do than it matters how we connect with the place where we choose to do it. Whether we seek answers in the dark corners of foreign cities or in a dilapidated cabin, we must first learn how to look. Sure, it helps to carry a flashlight, but the real trick, I think Alan would say, is just to know where you are. So thank you all, and I look forward to this really wonderful conversation.
Thank you, John. Melinda.
All right, thank you for having me. So my book is called Homestead, and it's my second book, and my short story collection, Bear Down, Bear North, Alaska Stories. These characters were sort of introduced in this book, and then this is sort of the follow-up. The book is based on my grandparents' story of them meeting in Anchorage and very suddenly becoming engaged and living on an old school bus on 150 acres of land in Point Mackenzie that first winter, waiting to build a cabin and trying to fulfill the obligations to get the deed to the land stipulated by the federal government. It's historical, and the background is sort of starts in 1956. And statehood is sort of looming in the background. And also my characters are new to Alaska. They sort of start learning more about Alaska's history, and that sort of challenges their ideas about land ownership. So I'm going to read from chapter 1. Pioneer Peak, June 1956. God made the trees and men make the kindling, they say. 150 acres of white spruce and paper birch, alder, aspen, cottonwood, and willow. Spears of evergreen pointed at the sky, and the pale and peeling bark, and the leaves of every branch. All for the taking if the acres are proved. Fell the trees and clear 20 acres of land to seed a crop, raise a cabin with nails and timber, and weather the seasons. This is the way to earn and own the deed. Lawrence stands where the cabin will stand, the marsh and muskeg easing miles toward the marine inlet of Kinnick Arm, and beyond the sloped rock of the Chugach Mountains and the soaring crest of Pioneer Peak cragged in snow, the highest point on the horizon. Here, in this place, the low rising to meet the bluff on the northern ridge line, and to the south, the thick lane woods that lead to the lake that has water for hauling. On these acres in Point Mackenzie, in the territory of Alaska, is where he will homestead. He had considered the map at the Bureau of Land Management as the man looked on, the parcels divided and numbered, free, and no price to be paid, though there were conditions. Traced his hand over the paper and waited for a feeling, a jolt of decision. So many prospects before him, and he closed his eyes and asked for a sign. And when he looked again, everything in him aimed toward the dot of a small lake. You sure? Said the man, stern. Most take more than a glance. He was certain. With the weight of his left hand, he wrote a signature, Lawrence J. Barringer, on the promissory title for lot 041180. Took the map he was given, and as he was leaving, Lawrence heard the man say, "Bastard won't survive the winter." Grit in his teeth, the official papers in his grasp, and he drove to Point Mackenzie, the miles ticking, that man saying he would amount to nothing up here, that he would abandon and forfeit his claim, had taken stock of him, lean and slight, and passed judgment quick as that, happened all his life. He drove for hours and the gravel road turned to mud, and then there was not an access road that he knew or any sense of a living. When there was a path no farther, he headed into the thick trees with a pistol and a compass, his rucksack filled with painted wooden stakes to mark the edges of his property. He unrolled the map and could not find the plot number or the terrain, and he blamed himself, and then he understood the wrong that had been committed against him, and he tore it in half. Should have checked the map, not trusted the man to do his job. This was not an honest mistake. Had it in mind to drive to the bureau and confront him. But he would not turn back now. He walked through the woods, the sweat of the search on his neck as the time wore, and the mosquitoes swarmed. And when he slapped the sting, the blood ran down, and he had to look away. Washed out the faint taste of metal in his mouth with water from his canteen, swished and spat, quickly dabbed his arm with a handkerchief. He went farther in, making his own trail, the needle on the compass his only direction. He crossed bare tracks, dry in the dirt, the claws short of the length of his boot, bigger than a black bear's. He knew to heed the signs of grizzlies, and he checked the bullets in the pistol, made his steps light. The ground edged the swamp with shallows, dark earth and muck, and he pressed on to find the lake. In the brush, a cow moose grazed with twin calves flanked at her side, their downy heads poking through the low shrubs. And though he was quiet, the cow herded the yearlings back into the thicket. At a pass, he came to a meadow, and in the open view of the grass, far in the climbing distance, a large white sphere, masted and man-made, a question. He drank more water from the canteen, leaned against a birch tree. Could belong to him for all he knew, this birch, the dewed ferns, bright in the blind of the woods, the sodden ground under his boots, the bloodthirsty mosquitoes. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Melinda. I feel like we've just traveled to 4 different universes. Although John and Melinda work kind of inhabited the same one. So I sent you some questions to think about. They're really just suggestions, but it occurred to me that these books are coming out just at the end, God willing, of the pandemic, and may have been at least partially written during the pandemic. And I was wondering if you get to the end of your writing career, you'll look back on these works and think of them as pandemic books in any way. Was there any shaping influence that time had on your work? If anyone has an answer to that, we can start sort of randomly.
I can start. So I just feel I had the project. I was mostly editing, and I sold the book in the middle of the pandemic. So that's actually how I got through the pandemic, because it helped fund my life when everything froze and teaching froze. So it seemed miraculous in a way. But the other thing is the book, I look at this book as sort of my constant companion. I started the pages in 2014, and I've moved many, many times to many different states throughout that. So it was another way the book to have that focus and to be hopeful to be editing a book and thinking eventually, maybe this will be over, hopefully, and the world will open again. So I think it'll be remembered as sort of after all these moves to then have to stay and wait and worry, that it was another way to just have, like I said, a constant companion, something I could turn to and think about instead of all the chaos that was going on. So.
That's interesting. So, so you worked on the book for 8 years or so, something like that. That's.
Yes, I'm a very slow writer.
I know all about
Not
that.
as slow as me. Melinda, I'll jump in because I can relate to a couple things you said. I've been working on this book for like close to 25 years, not the whole time, but the very first incubation of character came around in about 1997 in a short story I wrote when I lived in Missoula when I was like 23. And the book came out almost exactly 25 years after that. So you're not as slow as me, in case you feel that that's, whatever. We are what we are. But what I could relate to was what you said about the constant companion. I don't feel as if Lookout is a pandemic novel per se, because it was already written, completed. I actually sent the draft to my agent to go out with about a week before the lockdown. So the pandemic wasn't part of the incubation, but the parentheticals were. The very start was that, and then of course all of publishing shut down for pretty close to most of the summer, close to 6 months before people were catching up on their backlogs. And during that time, the George Floyd murders happened, a social justice boom hit. And so a lot of publishers were looking for books that were more of a contemporary moment. And I had a little crisis of confidence that fiction could even really matter at a time like that. I think I've come around to thinking that it does, but for a little while there, it seemed like, wow, this was the absolute worst time to have to go into the world with a book. But the constant companions, I felt as if these characters were with me through the whole pandemic because of the revisions and the returning to them over and over. They really did feel like companions in a way that makes them feel even closer to me, I think, than normal characters, because it was such an insular world for a while and they were so large. And then the parenthetical at the end about the pandemic was that finally, after a long time through various publishers and close here and not quite here, I had a little mini bidding war of like 3 independents, and I had to have interviews with them all during a week, and I got COVID. So I was like, finally, we made it through all of the gates for getting to a serious talk about publication. And then I actually got the dreaded disease, so I had to postpone it. So it was just kind of odd that it was shaped by the pandemic for sure, even though it wasn't written then. It was a weird time, huh? Pretty weird, yeah. In fact, every time I'm in a Zoom meeting, it feels like it's still part of the pandemic, because I'd never heard of Zoom before the pandemic, right? And then it turns out Zoom is kind of useful, not for every day, but for now. Sharon or John?
I can really relate to the chaos idea. As you know, David, I started working on this in 2018 when I joined the CWA MFA program at UAA. I'd had this book in my head for a really long time, and I really desperately wanted to get it out. And I figured I needed to give myself some motivation. So I figured if I joined the program and had professors forcing me to write it, I would actually write it. And so the first year I wrote the first draft, the second year I revised it, and the third year, which is when the pandemic hit, is when I put it on query. But it didn't really stop there, because I did manage to get an agent, but she wanted me to do some pretty significant revisions, which I did, and that took another like 8 months or something like that. And that's really when we were all on lockdown. That's when we were all huddled in our homes and not really allowed to go anywhere. Nothing was open, nothing was happening. And it was also during that time when I learned that I had lost my job because of budget cuts to the English department, and they were eliminating my position. And I was just unspeakably devastated by that. And so I think in many ways, I turned to writing this book as a way to escape from the realities of all of those things that were happening to me and to the world and to people. And I think that the book necessarily wasn't really shaped by the pandemic, but I was in many ways as a person and as a writer. I think that those years where I basically didn't leave my house at all ever had a big impact on my moods and my attitudes and my outlook. And I was so afraid of what was going to happen with the loss of my position. I think that had an effect on the writing and what I produced ultimately. So I was really, really pleased when I and my book intact managed to get through it and find a home at 2 wonderful publishers. 3 now. It's coming out in Italy as well in November. I'm very excited about that. Going to be translated into Italian. But part of me is a little scared now because I'm like, okay, I hope I'm not going to have to recreate that whole scenario in order to be able to produce a second book.
It'll only take 25 years.
I guess I don't want to I hesitate to say this because in some ways for me the pandemic was good for me in terms of writing, in terms of the time and space it offered. But I'm not sure it's necessarily the pandemic that shaped the book. A lot of what I'd written came out of my MFA thesis, which I actually completed in 2013. So about half of the book was, I had this idea for a collection of travel essays. And so I'd been trying to shop that around with not much luck. I know now there was a very good reason that I wasn't having that much luck. And some of that had to do with ideologies that were still evolving that hadn't fit into the book yet. And in December of 2019, my son was born. And in November of 2021, my daughter was born. So the book was accepted in the summer of 2020, right as the pandemic was getting toward its peak. And I had quit my job. We had these plans to move to California and live in Monterey. My spouse was going to go back to grad school there, and everything came to a screeching halt. And I guess to the degree that didn't happen, but she was able to pivot online. For that, we were able to save a lot of money. We were able to stay in our home that we're in now. And I got lucky. I got this position and then the realities of being a young parent kicked in right as the book was accepted, and we stopped sleeping, and sleep regressions turned out to be a far worse thing, and teething turned out to be something that wasn't just one tooth, but it turns out you forget that we have 20 teeth and they all come in over the course of many, many months. And so there was this really steep learning curve. And what I discovered is that all of the things I'd been struggling with to reconcile in my book, the fears about hyperactivity and ADHD that I'd never been diagnosed with, and trying to determine how to be present and located in one spot and to sit still, are all things that made me uniquely bad at being a parent to an infant. And so I turned to writing as best I could, but there's a lot in the book that was made far better by the realizations I had in becoming a parent, made far more mature in that very steep learning curve. But when I read it now, it still feels a little raw to me. And if I could go back, I think there's more work that I would like to do. And of course, there's always another book, and there's more work that I want to visit. So maybe it wasn't the pandemic so much as fatherhood, but I changed significantly during the editing process in terms of who I was as a father. And reading this now, I feel like I'm reading a stranger, just because so much shifts in those early years in me as a parent. And now they're 2 and 4, and I barely recognize this person I was when I was writing some of these essays. And it was a strange experience to have that, to be seeing this person I'm not, this unidentifiable human in these essays that I'd written that was apparently me. So it was a good experience, but yeah, hard.
Well, really, really interesting answers to that topic. The next topic I wanted to ask about is basically a topic about literary influence, but there's a lot of different ways you can frame that question. One way is, have you had any life-changing experiences because of things you've read? Have you, what's the book you most often recommend to a friend? What single book should every college student read before they are given a degree? Those are all really different ways of articulating the influence question. So what do you think? No influences.
I'll go first on this one.
Okay.
I found this question really hard to answer because there's just too much. I mean, it's a lifetime of influences. It's a lifetime of being shaped by, first what my parents read to me and then what I read, for myself. So when I was thinking about this, I kept thinking of eras of my life where I felt those changes happen. So when I was really small, my mom used to read me stories like, she used to read me picture books, and my favorite ones were the beautifully illustrated, sort of fantastical ones. The Oyster's Secret, The Lace Snail, The Wind in the Willows, the fables. I loved mythology, all of those sorts of things. And those, I think, engendered my passion for stories, for storytelling, and for just experiencing somebody telling me a story, which became one of my absolute favorite things. And then in the next phase, I would read things like, the Chronicle of Narnia, the classics, right? J.R.R. Tolkien. I'd read the Hobbit and things like that, and that really engendered my love for fantasy. I fell in love with dragons at that point, I think, because of Smaug. And I read lots of dragon books at that point. I moved on to the Dragon Riders of Pern and McCaffrey's books and all of that. But the thing that really changed my life wasn't a book that I read. It was a play, and it was Romeo and Juliet. My mother took me to see a performance of it when I was 7 years old, and that utterly changed my whole life. In that moment, I passionately fell in love with theater, with Shakespeare, with storytelling, and all of those things. And I knew that I wanted those things to be a part of my life forever. And so, unfortunately, they are. That worked out really well for me. And so I would say that is the sort of seminal text that had the biggest impact on me. The books that I recommend most to friends really depends on the friend, I suppose. But I'm passionately fond of retellings. Obviously, I wrote one. Retellings, reimaginings of folklore and fairy tales. And there's this one series called The Lunar Chronicles. The first book is Cinder, and that's the one I recommend the most. It's a retelling of Cinderella with a Chinese cyborg Cinderella and an alien evil queen from the moon, and I absolutely love it. It's one of the most imaginative things I've ever read. I love that, and I don't think anybody should leave college without reading Joseph Heller's Catch-22.
Nice little list there. Thank you, Sharon. Who's next?
Since we're talking about cyborgs, I'll recommend my books for college kids. I've been thinking about this a lot. And I think more and more about the responsibilities that we have as writers, and that I think everyone kind of has to have this awareness in a world. And the short story that keeps coming back to me in this very modern and often surreal time of technology is Kurt Vonnegut's Ipecac. I don't know if anyone knows this short story, but it's about a computer that essentially it's just an algorithm that falls in love and then commits algorithmic suicide, as it were. But it's a wonderful cautionary tale on the dangers of AI in this world. And then I think that that kind of responsibility we have as teachers should extend to place. And for that, to me, Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass is something everyone should read. It's the book I find myself recommending most often to people when I think about books in Alaska. More and more, I find myself recommending books written by Indigenous authors and about Indigenous realities. Most recently, I've read Sivulik by Lily Tizroyluk, and I absolutely recommend that book. It is a wonderful, wonderful, and incredibly powerful story. It is absolutely engrossing. And then I came across, this hasn't happened in a long time, I came across a classic writer who's actually a Chukchi writer from the Soviet era, Yuri Rithkru, whose book Dream in Polar Fog is one about the very far north that I had not encountered before. And it had been a long time because I have kind of a love of the literature of polar literature. And so it had been a long time since I found something that just blew me away and was new in that way. And we should all in this time also be reading The Handmaid's Tale, probably once a month for a very long time. So that's what I've got.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So go ahead.
No, you,
Nope.
it's fine.
Someone
Okay.
has to start the dance.
Am I going?
Go
Sorry.
ahead, please.
I would concur with John, what he just said. I haven't read the new book you just mentioned by Lily, but I've been seeing it around and I'm really looking forward to it. I recommend Blonde Indian by Ernestine Hayes all the time. It's probably one of the books I recommend within Alaska and also to people outside Alaska. Time and time again, it's a beautiful book. Her second book, The Tao of Raven, is excellent too, but Blonde Indian has something so incantatory about the oral story of Ernestine Hayes's life that I just can't recommend it enough. I feel like that would be one I would recommend for college students for sure. Also, Notes of a Native Son by James Baldwin is one that I happened to be reading right at the start of the pandemic for totally unrelated reasons. And then the George Floyd event happened and all of the US started reckoning again with the, one of our formative wounds. And it absolutely astounded me how James Baldwin's essays sound like they could have been written in Harper's Magazine the month in response to George Floyd. They are that contemporary and just mind-blowing. So that would be one of mine. As far as the books that most formed me, I agree with Sharon that what was read to me as a child, everything from Maurice Sendak and Tales from the Bible. I grew up with a oral tradition of especially Old Testament stories, which taught me a lot about how to be a writer, like lyric language, don't be boring, how to make things full of tension and scary. It tuned my ear toward where were the women. And so that was all very formative. But the book that made my eyes open to being not just loving stories, but seeing how stories were made was John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, which I read in high school, which is an incredible story on its own. But that book, it was like a light went on about how he made a novel, how he chose to structure the chapters, not to go back into the high school lecture about it, but the alternating chapters with the story of the Joad family that was so immediate. And then the alternating chapters in which he's setting a larger stage about class and history and our country and all kinds of stuff. A light went on to be like, oh, that's how you make something, not just be carried along by a story. And that really influenced me for sure. He would be, I think, up there with the big ones. Can't remember if that was all of the questions or not, but those are the big ones that occur to me.
Good answers. Thank you. Okay, Melinda.
So one book I always teach college students in a fiction course, yeah, if I can, as much as I can, is Before You Suffocate Your Own Full Self by Danielle Evans. It's a short story collection. And it's just really great because it's a lot of coming of age stories about mixed race characters in the DC area, but her voice is just so brilliant and funny and sharp that, I mean, I've never had a student not like, and you know, her work. It's just one of the best ones to teach. In terms of books, I find myself recommending all the time. One is Love Medicine by Louise Erdrich, and then Lila by Marilyn Robinson. And a book that sort of changed my life will always be Cowboys Are My Weakness by Pam Houston, because I was an undergrad at Cal Poly SLO, and I had a fiction teacher say, I was just starting to write about Alaska and my family history, and she said, oh, you should read this book. And because of the story Doll, which is about a doll sheep hunting trip in Alaska. And then that's why I applied to UC Davis to work with Pam Houston, and I got waitlisted, but I think I called enough that they decided they should let me in, because I kept asking if a spot would open up. So those are, oh, and then if you're in high school in California, you're forced to read Steinbeck, and I loved Steinbeck, and Henry Rose, one of my favorites as well. So I think stylistically, I probably got some of that that spareness from reading a bunch of Steinbeck.
Wow, wonderful answers. I always love hearing writers answer that question. There's so much out there. And I like the way you framed it too, Melinda, because I always think in my 40 years of teaching, there was one book that never failed to get students excited and engaged, and it was Toni Morrison's Song for Solomon, which wasn't my personal favorite book until students got so excited about it, and I knew that, you know, it was a can't miss title for the syllabus. Okay, next question is, you're having the literary dinner party, and you get to invite 3 people, living or dead, to come to your literary dinner party. Who do you invite? Why do you invite them? What kind of thing is going to happen that night?
I mean, I'd love to have a dinner party with this group at some point.
That would be nice.
This has been really fascinating so far to hear everyone's answers. But I guess for me, I have 2 dinner parties that I'd like to go to, and they sort of reflect the different interests I have. And one, I would like to meet with a group of anthropologists. I miss my friend Alan a lot, and so much of this book, my book is informed by it. So much of my thinking and my teaching continues to be informed by his work. And if I could just get a chance to talk with him again about that, anything, it would be wonderful. But to be in a room with Alan, and interestingly enough, Alan Boris and Richard Nelson passed away on the same day. So we lost 2 great anthropologists in the state of Alaska that day. And of course, with Richard Nelson, a great writer. And I would love to have been, they were in the 80s, I think they were in the Alaska Humanities Forum together. And I would have loved to have been with that. And for kicks, I thought, since they're 2 incredible anthropologists, what would Margaret Mead have to say in that conversation? And so I'd like to do that. And then I thought about who I'd want if I was at a table talking about travel writing or talking about fiction. And I don't know who else I'd totally have at the table with him, but I would love to talk to Louis L'Amour. I am well aware that Louis L'Amour is perhaps the cheesiest and cliched writer in the Western genre, but I love that when there is a rock in a Louis L'Amour short story, there is a rock somewhere in Wyoming or Montana or Arizona that looks just like that. And he was very formative for me as a young man, both in terms of his ability to tell a compelling story and the energy he put into his work, and also aside from the obvious endings, they all end the same, and they all have incredible name characters. But his real life story was really a fascinating one as well. So those are my groups.
Nice, thanks.
I had two as well, John. I don't know what that, it's funny because I'm kind of shy at dinner parties with strangers, actually. So the fact that I couldn't narrow it down is a bit strange. But the first one that occurred to me was Emily Dickinson is a big influence for me, and also just a person I'm very interested in. I visited her house in Amherst. If anybody's ever there, I highly recommend going to the museum there. It's just incredible way to glimpse the living rooms of a writer. It really affected me. So she's known for being a recluse, but really within her circle, she was known to be quite witty and funny and very charming in her way. And I've always been kind of sad that she gets characterized as this like nutball in the bedroom who barely could make eye contact. She actually had many deep friendships, and she loved to eat and make food and play with her nieces and nephews. So I would have one dinner party in Emily Dickinson's drawing room, and I would invite two other somewhat soft-spoken poets, Vivi Francis, who is a American Black female poet who's just incredible and gives amazing readings. I heard her read once and would love to hear her read more. And Eva Salidas, who is a dear friend and mentor to many in Alaska. And I think she and Emily and Vivi would have a lot to say to each other. So that was one. But then I couldn't quite let it go. And another one that I came up with was I recently met J. Drew Lanham, who a lot of people know for his ornithology work and his writing on race and birding. He teaches ornithology, but also nature writing. He and I met at the Kachemak Bay Writers Conference, and in just a off conversation on the side of some event, we came upon the fact that we had both had two very formative influences, Willa Cather and Zora Neale Hurston, both of whom I think of as nature writers, although they're often more frequently described as domestic fiction narrative, but both incredibly evocative about their places. So I think a dinner party with Drew, Zora, and Willa talking about how to teach or think of them together from both Drew and I's very different perspectives would be pretty fascinating. So thanks for humoring me, the two.
I also had two. I don't know what it is, but I couldn't pick just one. Christine, by the way, you just named some of my absolute favorite writers. So I would like to come to your literary dinner party if that would be allowed.
You can come too. It can be all of us.
Zora Neale Hurston is one of my absolute favorite writers ever. She absolutely blew me away when I was an undergrad. But for my first one, I would have to get Jane Austen and Mark Twain together, just so I could hear Twain defend his statement that he would love to dig up her skeleton so he could hit her with her own shin bone. Because Twain hated Austen's writing so much, I would have to get them in a room together. And then I figured I would toss Mary Shelley in there because she could always make a party, and I figured she could referee them. And so, and all three of them have written texts that I absolutely adore. Pride and Prejudice is my favorite novel. Mark Twain is always a fun read. And I teach Mary Shelley all the time. I teach Frankenstein, and I find her influence on literature and storytelling incredible. She's one of the most, I think, formative writers that we've ever had in the Western world. But my other literary party would be kind of interesting. I think I would want Shakespeare to be there. I'm a Shakespearean professor. I'm a Shakespearean scholar. I used to be a Shakespearean actor. I would really want Shakespeare to be there. David also brought up one of my other favorite writers, Toni Morrison. I would definitely want her to be there. I've read her interviews. I've seen her interviews. She is always so inspiring. She is always so brilliant. And I just think an evening with her would change you. It would just change your life. And then I would want to toss Neil Gaiman in there because I've actually spent time with him, and he has this absolute gift of taking any conversation and turning it into something magical. I mean, I don't mean that literally. It's like he has a form of magic where when you talk to him, all of a sudden you're talking about the most esoteric amazing, surprising things. And I would love to see how that played out in a dinner party.
Okay, I want to come to yours too, because Twain and Morrison were on my third list, and I love the idea of Shelley with them. So, okay, if you can come to mine, then I come to yours.
You are absolutely invited.
Great parties. Melinda?
I only have one. And so Louise Erdrich and Marilyn Robinson, of course, but then I want to invite Faulkner and then Toni Morrison, and I want Toni Morrison and Faulkner to hear that discussion of their work and their writing, and also then I could ask all my writing questions of those four. That's what I would want.
That's quite a set.
And we would have Jackaloff oysters from Ketchimat Bay. That's my one request.
Yeah, the next question was, what would your menu be for that night? Oh, just kidding. I think we're at the 1 hour point, pretty close. So if you have any closing remarks, anything you want to say that didn't get said, now's the time.
I just want to reiterate, thank you, David, for putting this together. Thank you, Alaska Book Week, for giving us a forum to speak and to be heard and to learn and to listen. I always love doing these panels and things because I always learn so much from my fellow panelists. You are all absolutely wonderful. I cannot wait to read your books, and I'm so glad that I was able to do this with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon.
Likewise, I'll chime in and say I love Beowulf, Sharon, so I'm very curious. And I've told Melinda that Bear Down is one of my very favorite books of fiction about Alaska. And John, I haven't read your book yet, but we share the trail dog connection. So this has been a really great pleasure. And David, I wonder if you would put all the books that were mentioned, both at the recommendations and also just the just mentioned tangentially, could they be in a list on a sidebar or something so that folks watching this later and me who didn't write everything down could have a book list? Because I think we have a really
if each of you, I'm not sure exactly how technically to do that, but I'll find out. I'll try.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you, Christine. Great to see you. Melinda, anything?
Just thank you for including me and consider me part of the Alaskan writer community, because I'm in Alaska a lot, but just not there permanently. So I'm always sort of outside of many different communities. So it's nice to be included. Thank you.
Oh, you definitely belong in this group. Thanks for being with us. John, last words from you.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I feel honored. I think I still have a little bit of a sense of imposter syndrome when it comes to writing. So sitting in a group of incredible Alaska literary writers who I look up to is wonderful. But also I think philosophically, you know, these conversations, they're very much oriented to books, but the books that we write make a difference in the world. And we're telling stories that reflect reality, make meaning out of reality. And we live in an uncertain time, in an uncertain place, with a lot of crazy things happening around us, from COVID to climate change to George Floyd. And this world is one where we need these kinds of conversations. So thank you for your recommendations, but also thank you for what you've done in your work to think about those things. It's an honor.
Thanks so much, John. I really appreciate all four of you being here tonight. And thanks again to Trish Jenkins and Lila Voigt and Alaska Center for the book. They really do a lot of wonderful work for literacy in Alaska, and really grateful for them. So long, everybody. Thank you so much.